Welcome to today's session on the road to decarbonising industrial heat and the need for a clean heat strategy. Energy consumption is by far the biggest source of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, responsible for a whopping 73% worldwide. And within the energy sector, generation of heat and electricity is responsible for most emissions. And whilst there's been progress on sourcing power from renewables, the same cannot be said for heat. To address the climate emergency, we urgently need a dramatic shift in how industrial heat is generated to a clean heat strategy that addresses fully the role of renewable electricity alongside other alternative low-carbon technologies. Fuel switching, electrification, direct renewable heat sources, carbon capture and storage, and end-use efficiency might all have a part to play in the solution. Today we'll be exploring the challenges, the science, the incentives, and private and public sector collaboration that will be needed to make this transition a reality. AstraZeneca have assembled an expert panel to help bring this topic to life, but we know that there are many in the audience who have expertise too. So please utilise the chat with your comments on best practice as well as questions for the panel, and I will try to mention as many in the Q&A and final reflections. So let's introduce the panel. To start us off, we have Benjamin Norbury, who's the Global Climate Lead at AstraZeneca and supports the global business functions of manufacturing, R&D and commercial in delivering the firm's ambitious climate strategy. Then we have Dr. Julio Friedman, who's the Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Global Clean Energy Policy at Columbia University. And he's one of the most widely known and authoritative experts in the US on industrial decarbonisation. Then we've Marty Spitzer, who's the Senior Director of Climate and Renewable Energy at WWF, where he leads the organization's efforts to accelerate corporate leadership on climate and energy. And he's championed the development of Renewable Energy's Buyer Alliance and the Renewable Thermal Collaborative and the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And then lastly, we've David Croft, who's the Global Director of Sustainability, Environment and Human Rights for Reckitt Benckiser. And he's responsible for their work on environmental and social sustainability all around the world, working with farmers, communities and manufacturers across the international supply chain. And he also brings a wealth of additional experience from major global companies such as Diageo, Kraft Foods, Cadbury's, and the UK retailers Waitrose and the Co-op Group. So to start us off, Ben, can you talk a little bit about what AstraZeneca is up to?
Absolutely, thank you, Louise. So since 2006, we've been working towards our approved science-based targets. We got notification they were 1.5 degree aligned, but we know that we could go further. And in January, we launched our Ambition Zero Carbon, and this was to eliminate Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2025 without using carbon offsets, and then also to make our entire value chain carbon negative by 2030. And so if we focus on our major scope 1 and 2 sources initially, we do have some areas of comfort and discomfort. And let's have a quick look at the top 3. So we have, imported power. Right now, this week, we've just moved to source 100% renewable power for all our imported power globally, following the RE100 campaign and their criteria. And eventually, over time, we'll move this to try and lead in sustainability in terms of adding new renewables to the grid through, on-site PV or off-site power purchase agreements. But it's relatively simple, to make that step. Similarly, our marketing fleet, large source of scope 1 emissions for us, and we've accelerated our electric vehicle commitment under the EV100 campaign to move that forward to 2025. There is challenges, regionally around access to vehicles and charging infrastructure, but there's opportunities too. It's a known tech. We have regular renewal of our fleet, and we have that collective voice through that campaign. And then, so that brings me to the heat challenge. Pharma is a significant user in our own operations, but also in our direct first tier suppliers as well. We have uses around sterilisation, sanitisation, chemical processes, and also quality control around movement of air, drying air, cooling air, and whatnot. Outside energy infrastructure is not dynamic like our vehicle renewals are. And the majority of our heat is from natural gas, so fossil gas in boilers or in CHPs, which are efficient, but they're an efficient use of a fossil fuel. We're a medium user, and that seems to limit some of our options. So, heat pumps don't necessarily get us to the temperatures we need for some of our processes. Carbon capture and storage, is the cost and environmental benefits, do they work at the kind of scale we're operating versus a power station? And hydrogen, what can that do and when? We've got a 2025 goal, and can it deliver something for us then? So, we set our goals in terms of what the world needs rather than what we knew we could definitely do from day one. And we're 10% into our strategy now, and we're coming up against heat as maybe the area where we have the least transparency of exactly what we're going to do to achieve this. Efficiency is great, lowers our costs, but it's just, the scale of the problem is reduced, but we're a growing business, and there's going to be a ceiling of opportunity there. It leaves us with some relatively stark choices. Do we invest directly in renewable gas supply chain and infrastructure? We're not an energy company. We don't have the expertise there. It's not our industry. And there's also, you come up against the feedstock conundrum of very many questions get brought up through that. So do we have the time to answer all those and have a sustainable supply chain? The alternative could be electrification, established technology, but it would increase our costs, and that's counter to our aims to manage our costs and manage our prices. And why is that? That's because the fossil gas price doesn't necessarily reflect the actual costs of the impact of climate change and the impacts to health that we're trying to treat as well. So, just in summary, we want to raise the profile of this challenge. We want to show policymakers that there is a market and a demand for alternative sources of heat and clean fuels, and maybe it's time for an RH100 to get us there and galvanise the change. So, thank you.
So there's plenty there for us to unpack that Ben's introduced. Perhaps I could now move us over to Julio, Dr. Julio, to kind of unpack a little bit more from your perspective about what some of the heat challenge might be.
Thank you. I'm delighted to do that. And thank you again for inviting me to be part of this panel and to join you in Climate Week. I'm very pleased to see this topic is getting some attention for a couple of reasons. One, it's just hard. We don't have a lot of options to make low carbon heat. And that means it's also going to take time. These are capital intensive investments. There's real technical challenges to it. And so you need to start now if you want to get progress within a reasonable time frame. Most people also don't understand how big the challenge is. The emissions today from industrial heat exceed those of cars and planes combined. And I dare say we've spent a little more time working on cars and planes than we have on industrial heat. I also dare say that you have options like EVs and flight shaming. You can't really do concrete shaming or drug shaming. It just doesn't work. So net zero has really focused the mind on all this. When you have to get to zero, your options become limited. They all have challenges in terms of cost, feedstock, availability, reliability, supply chains, performance, all of these questions. What I have seen, and which AstraZeneca is already demonstrating, is that most companies would like to be farther ahead on this topic than they are today. And they are, in fact, ahead of where policymakers are in terms of what market aligning policies there are to provide low carbon heat. One of the things that is often lost in this discussion is the importance of the operational needs. Companies like AstraZeneca or ArcelorMittal, a steel maker, or Heidelberg Cement, or pulp and paper manufacturers have real requirements for temperature, for capacity, and for flux. And that's what makes this challenging. The actual energy that is in most heat is much higher than comparable loads from electricity. And in fact, electrification makes sense in some contexts, but requires a great deal more electricity and some substantial infrastructure development as well. You can use biogas, you can use hydrogen. These have questions associated with life cycle, with cost and availability. You can do carbon capture. Again, is it well suited in many contexts? Not exactly. Are you close to a carbon storage site? Maybe not. It may be that the best way to do this is post-combustion. It may be that CO2 removal through either managed ecosystems or through direct air capture and other engineered pathways is the best way to do it. But those are not very evolved as a market and are quite expensive or problematic. In that context, we really are going to need policy to set us free here. We are going to need to measure the stuff. We don't have heat markets today. So we got to start gathering the data that we need to make analysis. We need policies that provide incentives to manufacturers and producers to provide low carbon heat. And we need some kind of buyer's club. You mentioned now an RH 100 perhaps earlier. Let me start by saying it should be ZH, it should be zero heat instead of renewable heat. And if we can get to 50 in the next 10 years, I'll be thrilled.
Oh, more challenge laid out there. Can I move us over then to David Croft? Can you give us some views from your perspective? Do you add to the same concerns that AZE are highlighting?
Absolutely, yes, I do. I think from an RB perspective, we're present in around about 180 countries and manufacturing in around about 60. And what we see, particularly in our total supply chain, is a need for different infrastructure support in order to support that change. We've made some progress in our own operations with over 40% reduction since we began our current 2020 targets back in 2012. But the ambition to deliver SBTs for a Paris Agreement delivery by 2030 and an ambition for neutrality by 2040 across not just scope 1 and 2, but scope 3 as well, brings in a raft of new challenges, not just for us, but particularly throughout our value chain. When I look at our total footprint, in terms of carbon, about 3/4 sits in consumer use. And so it's important for us to make changes, but it's also important to see infrastructure changes across the board that help suppliers and consumers also help deliver on that carbon neutrality position. From a personal perspective, I look at 3 or 4 areas of critical performance change needed for us. Ingredients and their origins. That might be chemistry of ingredients. It might be natural ingredients in some cases in the processing of those. And then I think about how we process ourselves. And in our sites, we've got a mixture of opportunities to switch to electrification. And some of that has already been happening using local solar generation as one example where that's really viable. In some of our operations, India is a great place for that. But also we've got highly thermal energy intensive spray drying processes in other sites. And there, whilst we've begun a shift in some sites to alternative gases, the scale opportunity is yet something we need to realise. And that's where we're looking at infrastructure support. We've got an example where we're using landfill gas already, but we can only use that to around about 30%. So we're then left with a choice of, can we clean that up? Can we use it for more? Or what alternatives can we bring in? And as Julio said, alternatives like biogas are not yet at scale and requires a different perspective from us about how we might work. how do we access feedstock if we're going to go down that sort of road? And in the past, when I've worked in the distilling industry, it's been possible to access at scale feedstock at a local site level. But that's not true for every other sector. In fact, I think it's the exception rather than the norm. And so the question might come to be, how can infrastructures work around biogas or hydrogen support for the future? What needs to change to enable that? And also, is there a question around collaboration that rather than thinking about infrastructure that supports an individual site, do we start to think about clusters of activity that makes scale support for alternative routes on thermal particularly more viable? And they're the things that, as we start to explore collaboration around, we're seeing more opportunity. We're involved in a couple of collaboratives now that are trying to explore how you work differently and how you also, in doing so, work together to create opportunities, but also demonstrate, and Ben said this very, very clearly, I think it's very important to work through, how you demonstrate that the demand is there, so that the markets can evolve at pace, that there is an incentive, in fact, for markets to evolve to support that. Because if we wait just for policy to create a drive for laggards to change, then actually it's going to take too long in the journey that we have between now and 2050, even, let alone our event horizon of 2040 and Ben's of 2030. It will be too long if policy only penalises those who move slowly. Policy needs to incentivise people to move faster, and that's a carrot approach, not just the stick.
There's some great points. I want to come back to some of those a little bit later, David. Last but not least, Marty, would you give us your perspective?
Sure. Very nice to be here with you and to see this great panel. Thanks for that great setup, actually, because collaboration and working together were sort of major themes. And for WWF, that's been really at the heart of what we've been trying to do. Going back 7 years ago, we helped convene the group that became the REBA, Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, and it's focused on electricity. And it used the force of the buyer's voice working together with suppliers to try to drive change in the marketplace. And we've gone from 0 corporate renewable electricity transactions when we started, or 1 or so in 2013, to 23 gigawatts of purchases in the US last year. It took a while to get started, but it's been accelerating. We have taken the same approach with on the thermal issue. As we've worked with our corporate partners, P&G and Mars being 2 good examples, who were starting to look out, realizing that P&G is a good example, has 70% of its emissions from thermal and related energy. They weren't going to be able to get to their science-based target if they don't deal with it. But there was no easy solution, so they knew they had to get started. And together we formed this Renewable Thermal Collaborative, which brings buyers and vendors and academics and others together, cities as well, to see if we could come up with solutions together. And we can talk more about that in a minute. But that's the main driver that we're using to try to pull together what has largely been an orphan space in the climate issue, which was thermal energy. We actually have a summit coming up, and I'll talk more about that later, but that's something we're excited about.
Very good, great start. So let's move back to ask a few questions of our expert panelists. So Ben, can I start you off? Can you give us some thoughts on what AstraZeneca have identified you most need support with for the transition? What kind of collaborations do you think are really going to help?
Yeah, great question. I think we, like I said, in terms of the green heat, we're not an energy company. We're looking into the market to explore what's there, but we need to partner with those technology experts and the people who actually build infrastructure day to day, rather than the meddling ourselves, directly. It's we can be the demand side that creates the incentive potentially to invest in that infrastructure. So I think we need to have access to those partnerships. I think absolutely. We also need to, I think, in terms of collaboration, there's many innovations out there. One of them could be waste solvents to gas that can be used, and that could be collaborating with our peers and our suppliers. There's challenges there, obviously. Peers are also competitors, but I think this is pre-competitive, and absolutely sharing those things to create enough feedstock potentially could be an opportunity. It is difficult because if you have to go too broad to source your feedstock, then you kind of lose the benefit by transporting it all to your, say, gas generation plant. And I think support to pilot new technology. So our Gothenburg site in Sweden invested and got some extra support as well to invest in high lift heat pumps, which is basically electrification of some heat production. It's really innovative technology, but there's obviously teething challenges that happen as you're trying to roll these things out, and that's a risk to our operations and day-to-day running of a site. So somewhere an opportunity to pilot new technology, but potentially share the risk of that cost and impact that it could have.
And Julio, can I ask you, what do you think are some of those exciting innovations? Is hydrogen the answer here?
I think hydrogen is going to prove important. It is also part of the reason why is because, as Ben had mentioned earlier, a lot of the heat in industrial systems comes from natural gas. And it's relatively straightforward to swap those systems out with either biogas or with some zero carbon hydrogen supply. Europe certainly is going big on that. We've seen that in their policy announcements, and we're starting to see investors move into this space pretty quickly. There are technical limits and challenges with it. Some of that can be dealt with fairly easily, like sensors and controls, but fundamentally, we're going to start hitting infrastructure limits pretty fast. And what that means is that for something like a buyer's alliance, you can probably make a lot of progress, but you won't be able to get the industry as a whole without real infrastructure investment and without other kinds of actions. The same is true for biogas. Biogas can maybe serve 6% of the system, and then you're stuck. Like, you just can't get more than 6%. And so it's a great place to start, but you got to know that it's a stepping stone. It's not an end state if you want to get there. The last thing I'll point to, and I think this is important for hydrogen, but really for all of these supplies, the value of something like a buyer's alliance to get things going is actually very large. One of the reasons why is because it helps develop stuff like standards for life cycle accounting. It develops protocols for tracking and buying stuff. That's gold. That is information that buyers want and policymakers need. And so these sometimes little steps can really contribute a lot to understanding that can help us find better options.
Fantastic. David, can I ask you, in terms of your experience with innovations and some of the barriers to those innovations, you mentioned some of them in your introduction. Could you go into that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, of course, Louise. I mean, I think there are opportunities that we're coming through, and let's just pick up the point about collaboration in the first instance. I think Marty's point was spot on, and Julio said the same. We saw the value of RE100 in terms of renewable electricity, and I think the same approach is there, and it's absolutely vital for renewable thermal. It's as much about stimulating support to create that access to the market, to create the infrastructure to drive it forward. So, at the first stage, it's about creating the incentives for providers to come in by showing the demand is there and that that we're ready to access it. I think then, in terms of how you then go about it, I touched on a couple of things. I mean, I think biogas is an opportunity, but it's rarely, is it going to be absolutely at scale? I was fortunate to work on a site where we were able to get up to 80% supply out of local biogas production, but we controlled on that side the feedstock. When the site was running at full capacity, we could get 80% plus from biogas options. Now, but that was that for me is the exception. When I've explored that in other companies, it would require us not to a fundamental shift. We'd end up becoming waste collectors to support it. And that could ensue in having to set up on-site at scale biogas plants and potentially bringing 200 or 300 trucks a day in to bring bio waste in that you would then put into digesters or run in other ways. And for many companies, in many locations, that's just not viable. And what it then leads you to is, what is your innovation in terms of the structure of the supply chain going forward? And also maybe innovation in ways of working. Are there clusters of collaboration in certain locations where that type of new alternative bio option is viable because it's supporting 2, 3, 4, however many, locally to work through? I think the same is true on the hydrogen infrastructure. And the necessity of changes to the distribution infrastructure to make that viable at scale brings real issues. But in the shorter term, are there local clusters that can work, that can make both the generation and the distribution viable? And I think for me, there's a mixture of innovation. One is the technology and the technological approach and how you can switch, clean up landfill gas, one of the things I also mentioned, but also where it's viable to electrify. But where it is not viable to electrify, innovations on those alternative gases, driven through different ways of working, and maybe not seeing ourselves as individual, isolated sites, but seeing ourselves as a collective, a bit like a water catchment area approach, seeing yourself in a cluster of people who together, not just industrial, but maybe domestic as well, you start to drive a change towards renewable thermal that's accessible in that cluster, locally generated or locally distributed, whichever works best. Now, that's a challenge for most businesses who in the past have worked well on their own in a way and have been set up to work individually. But as we think about a circular economy type of model and a circular energy supply, perhaps, you start to think, how do you change from that linear model to a much more part of a circle? And that's quite an innovative way of thinking, that if we can progressively move to that, then not just on the energy side, but on other aspects of a sustainable business for the future, I think we've got opportunity.
It's a huge step change, though, in the way that we operate and work together. And that's where really, Marty, it comes us back to collaborations that are going to work. And I'm really curious to understand, are we going to be able to do this without regulation, or are we going to need regulation to get people to collaborate effectively?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm so pleased that Julio set up, I think, a very important role of policy, because regulation is just one form of policy, right? There's legislative policy. I mean, I don't know if others would agree with this, but I see this as, having spent so much time in the electricity sector, we could argue that in some ways we're, in the thermal space, we're 10 to 15 years behind where we were in electricity, because we started making investments in renewable electricity long ago as a society, creating renewable portfolio standards, creating all kinds of policy incentives, tax incentives. That doesn't really exist here. And so we have our work cut out for us, and it's why Julio's right that we need to have a long time horizon. We are not going to solve this in 3 years. What we can do, though, is we can identify the opportunities, and I think we've seen some technical feasibilities of various technologies, but we have to do a lot more to get them to be cost effective. And it's not going to be one. I mean, if the silver buckshot approach, we've all heard that phrase before. I feel like we're going to be looking at a lot of things, and there's not going to be one solution from a technology side. And then even from the corporate side, the user side is the needs are very different. There's boilers, and so yes, that's a common technology that you can think about. But the actual implementation of a heat source in a production line is going to vary often from company to company, and they're unique. And it's not the same as the cut and paste you can have by, here's how to build a wind farm, here's how to build a solar farm, and by the way, the issue is how do we get it onto the grid? But once it's on the grid, it's a fungible resource, and it flows as electrons. We're not going to be able to move heat like that. Now, we could move some heat, we can store some heat, we can transfer heat. I think this is why it's so exciting. I get really animated about this particular topic because we're at a moment where we really are just starting to think about it. And before, we had people like Julio thinking about it, but we weren't thinking about it together. And solutions policy solutions. We're going to need to work together on policy. We're going to need to work together on technology, creating markets, getting information. So I think we're just at the cusp of the beginning of this journey, and that's why I'm so excited. But we have a lot to do.
And can you give us any views on the collaborations that are going to be really effective?
What I've learned, this is not limited to this space or even electricity, is that if you look at the system problem that we have here, which is from technology to markets to moving to infrastructure and finance, we're going to need to bring all the players to the table in one way or another. And they won't all come together at the same time, but we will need different players who are members of this system to be talking to each other, because what we've discovered is we learn so much from each other when we actually stop to listen. So when I hear AstraZeneca say, I need this, and 5 other companies are having the same problem, and we bring some of the providers and the services together to help solve that, and then we take those messages to policymakers, I think that's the kind of synergy that we're going to be looking for. The Renewable Thermal Collaborative will try to do that. We've been doing that. And just because it was mentioned twice, like the idea of a zero, what did you say, Julio, zero heat, 100 or something like that. Those kind of goals are the stars in the East. Like when we started, it was before RE 100 on REBA. Because if we had said we wanted a 100% goal, everybody would have laughed at us. They would have said, what? How is that possible? Today, people are accustomed to that. But having a star in the East is important. Having an implementation collaboration that makes it possible to actually do that 100% goal, or 50% or 70% or whatever your company's goal is, that's going to be really critical.
So Julio, can I come back and ask you about cost? How do you think we're going to finance these kind of collaborations?
Right, so there's really only 3 sources of money. There's taxpayers, there's ratepayers, and there's shareholders. That's it. And often when we talk about cost, we're really talking about who pays. And that has trade implications, that has real commercial implications. I'm never cavalier about this issue. So when I hear somebody say, oh, well, you can just electrify your heat supply, that can be really expensive. And if you want to electrify it with zero carbon electricity, it can be even more expensive in most jurisdictions. So, okay, so what do? This gets to, again, for me, the fundamental role of policy. Marty made a point of how we started in renewables really in 1992 with the wind production tax credit and with early renewable portfolio standards. That was over 25 years ago. And it took industrial policy and standards and investment tax credits and production tax credits and feed-in standards and infrastructure build-outs and all these other kinds of things to make it real. We're really talking about the same sort of thing here. If we want low-cost hydrogen, well, we better build hydrogen infrastructure. We should create some kind of performance metric or investment tax credit to do it. And the same thing with building biogas digester feed-in systems and all these other sorts of things. You can't expect the corporates to pay for all of this. It's just unreasonable for a company like AstraZeneca to build hydrogen infrastructure. Like, that's not going to happen. So it is going to be an all-hands-on-deck kind of thing. In that context, if we want to manage cost for people who buy things, whoever they are, then we got to be proactive about thinking about where there's low-cost opportunities in the near term and what infrastructure is needed.
So we've had some great answers from our expert panel. I'm now curious to go to the floor and to take some of the questions from the chat.